Today, join us for part 2 of our reality transformation discussion with author Chris Stiles. This discussion will continue the look at psychological effects from experienced events that have shown to cause ongoing and life-changing effects on some people. Stay with us and learn more.
Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
No, moving against the wind. And you could see the structure inside of it. And with the binoculars, I was lucky enough to have a quality pair of Steiners, and I had a really good sharp image. And you could see odd little details inside. It wasn't just simply a cube and a sphere, it was that. Like at one point in the corner, there was something that looked almost like a Mobius strip. And when you looked at it, it was almost disorienting to stare at it directly. Little things like that.
What's in a Mobius strip?
A Mobius strip is, if you had a strip of paper, like say about a foot long and about 1 inch wide,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just cut out like a rectangle, and I take the two ends and join them together. If I twist it
Yeah.
and then fasten it together, that's a Mobius strip. And
Oh, okay.
what's the significance of that? It only has one side.
Hmm.
If you start to draw a line on it, you will meet it yourself, no matter how
Right.
yeah. A lot of people don't realize you've
Interesting.
actually taken a two sides and made it into one side, right? Well, there was an object like that looked twisted like that, and that's the first thing I thought of when I seen it. But if you tried to focus straight at it, it was hard to stand.
Yeah.
Now,
That's crazy.
none of that speaks of RT as such, but here's the part. I've kind of told this one backwards. Is that when I picked up Heather Doucette in Shag Harbor, and we were about to drive to Yarmouth to, hear of the strange encounters that the physics teacher had there. When I first picked her up, she sat in the car and she said, "Do you feel that?" And I didn't know what. I said, "Feel what?" She goes, "Something's going to happen today."
Hmm.
And I said, "Yeah, well, I don't know, maybe." And she said, "No, stop. Just listen. Just sit back. I want you to think about it. Do you feel it?" She goes, "If you don't say so." And I was like, "Okay." And she goes, "Do you feel that?" And I did. And she said,
Really?
Then she goes, "Do you have any idea what it is?" And I go, "No. I probably wouldn't have noticed it if you hadn't said." She goes, "But you do feel it now?" Yes.
Interesting.
That was that day. Now, here's the other thing is where we ended up watching this play out, which was, by the way, when we got there, just the last 7 minutes of the sighting that had gone on and off for an hour and 20 minutes.
Right.
When we get there, I had been to that spot already, and one of the reasons I knew where it was before that I was filming a documentary with the Jacques Cousteau's grandchildren, Celine and Fabien Cousteau.
Hmm.
And
Cool.
one day they didn't need me in the shoot, and I was going to drive into Yarmouth, and somebody called up and said, could I talk to you about a UFO event I had? And they had me meet them there. And this girl who was in great distress told me of a close encounter she had there with something she described as one of these, what do they call them, the go fast, is it? With the sphere
Oh, yeah.
inside. And she was, eventually people were going home. She was there for the first warm day of that summer here in Nova Scotia. And about 4 o'clock, she sat up and realized she was the only one left on the beach. And she looked up and this thing was descending toward her from above. And she became paralyzed and she thought she was going to die. Again,
Oh,
no abduction scenario, nothing like that. But she heard whispers and could not move until it left. And
Whoa.
when the day that we had the sighting, that's exactly where we had it. And I had told nobody because my concerns for this person and what she was asking me for is somebody she could trust to seek treatment for the trauma.
Right.
And I just hadn't told everyone because in a very small community, I learned over the years. I mean, think about the Smith brothers, where I'd ended a friendship, where it's very tricky, when you're in a fishing village, when you're in these
Right.
little towns, right? And at the time, this woman was in extreme distress. Well, when I go back to witness this on 2018 in September, after being shown that very location the month before, that's what she told me. And none of the others with me that day knew that until afterwards when I shared that.
Mm,
That's how I knew where to go. Like, so,
that's crazy.
but there's that premonition aspect, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing too, is it was a great chance for me that day, not just to watch this unique UFO event and to feel this premonition thing, but while this is playing out on the beach, the people that I was with, Heather Doucette, Lori Wickens, who's the chairperson of the Shag Harbor Incident Society down there, and other people in the group who were there, to see their reaction to it and how they were being affected, and everyone seemed to be being affected different. So again, like how there's that second type of RT in terms of how the event itself is. In this case, the premonition aspect or the aftermath or Oz factor seemed to be tuned to the person too.
Yeah.
Because like at one point when we were standing there, Heather seemed very unsteady in her feet, and I asked her, and it was almost like somebody that was hyperventilating or oxygen drunk, although she wasn't doing that.
Hmm.
And she said, I go, why are you, and she was euphoric and laughing. I said, why do you feel like that? She goes, I see these things all the time, but I'm always alone or with one person who doesn't care. She was the first time I've been hearing there's a crowd of people around and we're all seeing it.
Yeah.
It was, for her, this experience, Tony, was vindication.
Right.
Okay?
I can see that.
Right? I look at the guy who first called me there, Justin Brown's a friend of mine who had seen it and was attempting the video, being very frustrated trying to video it, having trouble with his equipment, And for him, he seemed extremely anxious, like literally pulling his hair and talking very rapidly and frustrated, and had trouble calming down for several days afterwards and felt nauseated when he got home, like it was distressful, right?
Yeah.
Others told me that they could see it earlier, but then could not see it when it was at its closest, but their friends could still see it. Again, that RT2 factor, right? And I was so lucky that I'd been there, because the last time I'd seen anything that was this certain as to its unconventional nature would have been when I was 12, the night of Shag Harbor. In between, it was a lot of things that were interesting, curious, but not near as compelling, right?
Right.
But again, so that kind of revitalized my well, let's call it sort of obsession. It's waned some since, because there's only so much of me to go around with that aspect of the phenomena, because I don't understand how that's so ignored here. I consider this reality transformation aspect of it to be, how can I put this, kind of a minority theory that should have never been abandoned or ignored, right? Another one, by the way, I think should have never been ignored, that I think was interesting how it played part in the very interesting fictional movie No.
Yes.
See,
I was just thinking about that film
the
yesterday.
idea of the, some of these things are actually living entities unto themselves.
Yeah.
Right? And I first started encountering that looking into Canadian Navy cases where most of these guys were like, well, these things live 50 miles up in the atmosphere. The Naval Research Board knows this, like it was a fact, Really?
Wow.
And I heard this from enlisted men and officers, right? And that just got tucked in my mind because they couldn't show me any material. Like nobody, but it seemed to be general knowledge amongst naval personnel. And I thought, well, that's a bit odd.
Interesting.
And I questioned it. But then that surfaced in other funny areas, because later on I can remember rereading the Condon report and trying to get some of the stuff that they had missed, or when I was in Philadelphia, because the papers and all the research papers for that, the stuff that didn't get in the book, is kept at the Philosophical Society there in Philadelphia. And one of the last times I traveled to the U.S., I went there and looked at it. And one of the things I found interesting was that they did not succeed, even though they had a presidential clearance, of interviewing some of the astronauts that flew the X-15, and they were prevented from doing that. And interestingly, what they expected to hear was that these guys had these kind of sphere-like things that would appear and play cat and mouse with the X-15 50 miles up.
Crazy.
Which they described as behaving more almost like a living creature, you know. And that was one of the few things that, despite Condon calling and complaining, although we know he wasn't sold on UFOs himself, the reality of it, he was quite upset that even a presidential clearance did not get them access to these interviews and questioning these pilots that were flying the X-15 mission. So, you know, it would turn up in strange places like that, from the Canadian Navy to little things that were missed by the Condon Committee. So there's another minority theory I think that shouldn't have been chucked aside. Again, I think all these things only apply to some cases, right? I think there's, and this comes under for me the umbrella that I believe that there are multiple causes for the unknowns. You know, multiple unearthly, you know, causes, right? But I think those are things that are abandoned. And when people say, why would you do this? What's the message here, if any? And, you know, maybe that's it. Maybe some of these are just a message. And I've had people say, well, you know, maybe it is like Star Trek or the movie Contact, where you don't want to contaminate the lesser culture. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And up here in Canada, I have a sort of variation on that, and I've called it the Inukshuk theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that term or know what an Inukshuk is. Up in the Canadian High Arctic, Inuit people, right, and other native groups, Denny, they sometimes, before they leave an area, an encampment, when there were a few now living more as nomads and would move on, you know, where the hunting would go, where their needs took them, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they would leave area, they would take rocks and stack them up and in a rough image, and it kind of looked like a man. You'd have a couple legs and a body and armor, head, just stack of rocks that would imply that. And they'd leave these things, and there they were. Yeah. And I guess early on, when, you know, people from the Hudson's Bay Company or Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers were up north, as, you know, white influence was expanding up there, they would see them do this. And when they would ask, like, what is that? A Inukshuk, you know, what's that for? What does it mean? What it does is it tells the people we were here.
Yeah.
You know?
Interesting.
A very simple message, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, when I look at something like, say, what happened on Cape Sable, or when I look at you know, trying to call the neighbors out at the Webster sighting, or the X-15 pilots, or whatever. Maybe it's that simple. We're here.
Right. Right.
But, you know, we don't have the language. We don't have this, you know. We don't usually see you 50 miles. We don't usually see you up here, you know, wherever, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, and I call it the Inukshuk theory, like it's a message. It's a one-way message. I've got a lot of useful one-way messages through history, from like Willie Shakespeare, or looking at the beauty of Notre Dame Cathedral or whatever, right? You know, these are messages in a way. I mean, when you walk into that cathedral, it's a message.
Right.
You could believe in heaven. You could,
you
know, you can see the power of man and God's work, you know, is what it's supposed to impart, and it does in its way. Well, you know, maybe some of these sightings that don't seem to make sense, that don't seem to amount to a lot, why would you do them? Why do you appear? You know,
right.
Now the people know we're here.
Yeah. Well, Chris, as I was thinking about this conversation that we were going to have, I had jotted down some notes.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, if I throw out 5 or 6 points, can you share what you think about them. Do you
Sure.
think that they fall under this space? And then elaborate on any of them if you want.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair? Yeah.
Fair enough.
I think the first one. So the first one, as I was thinking about this topic, I thought ontological shock, a type of RT, fall into this space. And what do you think about that?
Well, in a way, I guess it's like the ontological argument of saying Augustine, right? Yeah. Some people come back at that and say that it's just semantics, that it's much ado about nothing and trying to create something from nothing, and that it falls short. You know, I think on its own, that wouldn't grab me, or we wouldn't be talking about that today. For me, it was only, and maybe this speaks more of my shortcomings, but it only became worthy of me of research when it was in my face, you know, when it couldn't be ignored anymore, you know. And it's the oldest adage in the book, but seeing is believing.
Yeah. 2, altered perception of time and space.
Well, you look at it like a physicist, and they would say, some of them say, there's something that's open to interpretation, modern physics, they struggle.
Yeah, that's right.
A physicist would tell you that it's a human perception that time doesn't really exist. You know, I mean, that's meaningless to us, isn't it? We all feel it.
Right.
I find that anything, you know, when you look at it purely academically, you can look at it, they say these amazing things, but we perceive things as humans, and, you know, what's real to the mind is real. And if it isn't real to the mind, it may be real in the larger sense, but if it isn't real to the mind, you could almost say it's not real, as far as we're concerned.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And for when people say there's no such thing as time, or there's no this, or we may be just a holographic projection, when you get into that kind of outlook, I think that's can only come, despite the intellectual argument they may have, and even the soundness of that argument, that this is a person that went through life, their life rolled easy. They didn't know a lot of pain. Pain is pretty undeniable. You know, struggle.
Right.
But that's what we are. You know, we are this. I mean, to humans, in a sense, I mean, we know there's atoms and molecules and quarks and subatomic particles and wave function. But to humans, really, the universe is made of stories.
Right.
That's how I look at it. You know, that's how we see it, right? That's, by tradition, how we would have explained it, isn't it? That's mythology, right? And I think in a larger sense, that's still our reality. You know, that's the level where it becomes important to us.
Yeah. The next one reminds me kind of like experiences people have in religion and other things. And I wonder if it would fall into this category, and that is spiritual or mystical awakenings. Do they experience something and it changes their view going forward? And would that fall under an RT?
An epiphany.
An
epiphany. You know, yeah. Well, it can. And I think, in fact, in modern organized religions, I think some religions prepare people for it, or are more attuned to it, or at least opening them to that acceptance. Let me give you a funny example for that. Let's take something that on the surface, if you didn't know much about either, and very interestingly, I seen this case trying to explain it to an Asian friend, you know, who was still struggling to get a greater command of the language, but a very, very intelligent, very perceptive guy. We were walking around one day in Halifax, and I was walking down Spring Garden Road, and you pass an Anglican church, and the doors were open. It was a Sunday morning. You're walking around, and you could hear them offering mass, and I looked in, and it was near that point, and I said, wait for this. And you hear the prayers of when the Anglican priest is consecrating the host to give out for communion, right?
Yeah.
And saying the prayers. And we went a little farther and caught the Catholic Church on a rare day. They had the doors open. We walked in far enough. We didn't go in, but in the back door you could watch this. And I said, listen to this. And almost identical word for word, the same prayers, right? And I came back out and as I explained to the Asian friend, I said, so if we had gone back and we waited for the Mass to end, their ceremony, as I explained to him, and you'd ask that Anglican priest, what have we just witnessed? He would tell you that you witnessed a symbol of the Last Supper, of sharing the last meal with Christ and having communion and blah, 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 but the key word being symbol.
Yeah.
If you ask the Catholic priest, what did we just witness? He would tell you, you had just witnessed the miracle of transubstantiation.
That's a new
It
word
is
for
not
me.
a symbol. In Catholic dogma, when they consecrate the host, that is the body and blood of Christ when you take it. It is not a symbol of it. And for that limited few minutes that exist in some physical form in your body, that is, you are in communion with the deity. That is the miracle of transubstantiation, right?
Yeah.
On the outer surface, observing what you're seeing, it looks exactly the same. The prayer sounded exactly the same, at least since Vatican II in 1960. You can tell I was a former Catholic, eh? But, Dom spiritual, right? But you get the point. So it's the perception and it's the interpretation of the event that makes it what's here. You can go through the exact same thing, but it has a different meaning to Anglicans and Catholics. Right?
Yeah.
So a Catholic would be, I would suggest, probably more attuned in their upbringing, their training, and their religious belief system, if they're, a serious adherent, that even the prayer, what is it, the profession of the faith, I believe in God Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and all things visible and invisible. It's a very open thing, right? But again, interpretation, there's a big difference between a symbol and you're witnessing the miracle and you're in communion, with the deity. So, we often say in ufology, for any UFO event, there are two things you need. You need the UFO and you need a witness. Well, in religion, you need, again, it's the same concept, isn't it? Very similar, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm not trying to say that, ufology is a religion. Well, it is for some. That's okay. They can do that. I don't bend any arms. But I think that often what happens is the moment when you're up close and personal with a genuine UFO event, it can be transformational. It can be like being struck by lightning on the road to Damascus or St. Paul. It can change the course of a life.
Right.
And there you have it. And I think about those statements from the Smith brothers, and many other people have told me this. I knew right away. I think about Heather Doucette in Shag Harbor, living in this little fishing village nowadays, and like so many other experiencers, when I speak to them, she has been a repeater, and no, it's not every other weekend. It might be once in 10 years, right? But these are pretty serious events, something backed up with other UFO events in the community that had multiple witnesses. It's a case I take very seriously. And, when I look at somebody when they're the age to appreciate what's happened, in her case it was a young teenage years on her second encounter. At that age, what happened. The Catholics say the age of reason. They have such a thing. They say is 7, so they can receive certain sacraments and take part in certain things they previously didn't in church ceremony. But when you look at somebody who's 15 that's had this encounter, when I've met these people, these young women and men, more often it seems to be women, and I ask them, like, what was it like? They say, everything they were taught was a lie. They knew they were alone. Their life as they'd known it had ended right there. Some of them even compared it with the fictional cliffhanger in that episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where it ends with Picard captured by the Borg, and he says, "Well, it's okay. We make our choices. We choose death, and the Borg announced death is irrelevant. You will be absorbed."
Right.
Pretty dark, right?
Yeah.
But it's like that, at that point, and of course the people, I'm not one to spend a lot of time with that aspect of the phenomena. There are people much better equipped to deal with that than me, but I do encounter it occasionally. And sometimes people leave the care of professionals to ask me advice or how I feel about it, and usually what happens is the person that's a specialist in that field will tell them, oh, well, at that age you crossed the clinical threshold, and they're using that terminology. But again, they would tell me that was when their life changed, their life before and their life after. And I find it interesting that I hear that for abduction scenarios, but I hear it for sightings from a distance too, where
Right.
they're certain of what they've seen. It was personally transformational. So
I have three more. So
yeah,
this fourth one here reminds me. I think we've been talking about this. So I was going to ask about shift in worldview and belief systems, and we've, like the example you said, where the person said everything's kind of a sham, or that's not exactly what you said, but essentially he was saying the truths I've been brought up believing,
mm-hmm.
it's not quite that, right?
Yeah. Kind of
Kind of
everyone
falls into
lies to
this.
you is what they feel. They, at first, I mean, over time it mellows a bit, but at first they're just so disappointed, right?
Right.
You know, um, yeah, the worldview has shifted. I don't think we know how to look at ourselves. Um, how can I put that? We've changed as a culture and as a species. And yes, you have the explosion of technology and communication and all the things we enjoy nowadays. I mean, I can remember as a boy till now how much we thought as this stuff came, how this would help the field, but I don't think it has.
Right.
If anything, it's cheapened it. I used to say that in the past, 90% of everything you'd read or perceive was crap. Well, that's now 99.9, and it's so accessible, so easy to report. There were things, for example, like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you know, started to fade in the 90s. You could look at things and say, okay, we have 7 reports that came in looking back at this case to, police and military sources. So you could multiply that by 10, and that's how many witnesses were probably out there. And that times 10 thing would hold, and I've seen it borne out many times. Shag Harbor is a great example, where 7 people called the RCMP right away. Also interesting that no one reported a UFO. They thought there was a plane crash. They were worried about survivors. By the time the RCMP get to the fish plant, there's probably 10 times that. They're in a crowd waiting to see what they can do to help. So that
Yeah.
10 times figure was often borne out when you go back and reopen a cold case. But nowadays, I mean, with the tools of social media and everything else we have, it spreads, right? But I don't think we understand how we've changed. Remember how I mentioned earlier the great cathedrals of Europe like Notre Dame?
Hmm.
Nowadays, if you came up with a great UFO project, or when we think about what SpaceX is trying and others, or there are people that have suggested, well, with current technology, if we wanted to make a generational shift, we want to do this, we could be going to a nearby star system. Fine. But that won't happen because it doesn't happen in a 4-year presidential term and the budgeting.
Right.
You go back to Europe in the 1500s, the people that started building those cathedrals, that designed, that began working on them, knew they wouldn't see the completion. But
True.
they solved
Yeah.
things. They invented solutions along the way, flying buttresses because the walls were collapsing outward from the weight of the stonework when the roof went. And we see these great things, right? That won't happen anymore. We've changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Think about that for a minute, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
It's a little sad.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It is.
We don't have any long-term vision. We don't have it. We certainly don't have any that goes beyond us, our existence.
Right. Yeah. Um, the fifth one I had was increased psychic sensitivity or synchronicities, which falls into the premonitions, right? Is that
Yeah,
that same
yeah,
area? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, something else that interests me because, um, and I suggest to people, a great book to read on that is the one by Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, who wrote one in the 50s shortly before he died.
Hmm.
Uh, that's really great on the topic. But yeah, just ask the question again. Something came.
Yeah.
I throw in that was really good. Ask me again. Number five is
Yeah.
it or whatever?
Yeah. It was just about increased psychic sensitivity
Oh
or
yeah. Okay.
synchronicities.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course synchronicity was right out of Carl Jung and all that, right? But here's the other
Yeah.
thing that passed through the back of my mind saying, "Oh, don't forget,"
Yeah.
which is this. Um, some people think that's why there's greater sensitivity to this day in Russia than here, because when you look at the history of Europe, when there was, they were purging and executing witches and all that, and people that had arguably natural psychic talent and were attuned to it, that didn't happen in Russia.
Hmm.
So there's more of it in the gene pool to this day. I find that an
Yeah.
interesting theory, but that may or may not have some credibility, right? But yeah, and the other thing is there's much more credibility given to that in Europe and Asia than there is here generally. Although, as we know, the CIA dabbled in it, and the Pentagon, trying to encourage and
Yeah.
develop that, trying to control it and make it
How can they use it?
scientific. And,
Yeah.
yeah, and that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the trouble with premonition often, like it can be strong, but it can still be a blunt tool. I mean, I think about the day when Heather made me make the call with her, like, and I go, yeah, yes, I do feel, yes, something is. What? I don't know either.
Right.
But we are
It's just
convinced,
different.
like, it was going to happen, and it did. So I don't know how useful that is. It was useful that day. But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, so I,
Interesting.
I, I think, yeah, that's interesting that, again, I think America's view is not the worldview on that. And then when you look at that history, and some people that study the paranormal history seriously, I think that Russian example, there might be something to it. And there's certainly, when you're over there, there's more awareness and openness, yes. And maybe it
Yeah.
is in the gene pool.
Who knows? Number 6, and the last one of these, was just this sense of mission or purpose that can happen after a RT type event, right? I mean, some
Mm,
people just, I'll never drive down that road again, right?
yeah.
But other people, like I think of like a Stephen Greer who thinks this happened when he was 17 and 18 years old, and now he's got to do this and get disclosure. Whether people
Mm.
believe that or not, it just feels like kind of the other extreme or the other end of that same concept.
I can remember feeling like that when I was 12 after witnessing what I witnessed in Metro. It seemed to fade out after a couple of years. I always had a strong general interest. I never really got involved in UFO research until the early 90s, right?
Yeah.
And but once I did, I mean, so in my case, yeah, there was after that first encounter at 12, on the waterfront here in Metro, there was the urge, there was a reaction, but you can only do so much as a 12-year-old, and I kind of failed to really connect. I mean, I went out to the library and understood as best I could and read books like The UFO Experience by Hynek at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
tried to write down notes in memory, and when I think I would see something, I would call a nearby base, and I was always amazed how they would take it quite seriously, and I felt it was strong, but nobody seemed to share it, and life got in the way for me, right? So
Yep.
I can't say I was obsessed then. I quickly became obsessed throughout the 90s because I was lucky. I got in and had such success with the Shag Harbor incident, and uh, I knew that there were other cases like that out there, somehow have been missed. And even now, to me, that's one of the greater mysteries in the field, is that some of the strongest cases, some of the strongest data is still being missed. It's just slipping away into the dustbin of history. And there's just so much repetition on things that are, just not as significant, that don't yield a lot of data, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and like the general interest kind of comes and wanes with the most successful fictional movie at the moment, I find. Although I find the ones I like best are the ones that don't get a lot of attention, like when we mentioned Nope. I
Yeah.
think that's a great film, and,
It
and a
is.
good piece of cinema too. It's just a great movie, but
It
so
was. Yeah.
refreshing. But yeah, and of course the idea of that some UFOs are that living thing, that goes back to the New Zealand researcher Trevor Constable and his work,
Hmm.
the sky creatures and that. But like I say, I look at these tales from people that worked in naval research here in Canada. I look at Condon trying to wonder why can't we get to these X-15 pilots? Like we've had such access, and they're
Right.
just saying, "Oh, presidential clearance, that's not good enough." Where do you go from there?
Right.
Right? Well, again, that might be like the movie Independence Day. Since we're picking on fiction there, I love that scene. The one where Bill Pullman is the president, right? And he
You're
goes,
right.
"How come I didn't know about this?" And they go, "Sir, you don't have enough security."
Yeah.
The
That was
commander
a
in
great
chief,
part.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
but I think that's the reality because ultimately these things I think are controlled by career people of military intelligence and probably rogue members of that elite too.
Right.
That are
Right.
just doing what they want, eh? Throw it in the drawer, destroy it, share it with friends or who they trust or whatever, or not. And who
Or
are they
not. Yeah.
answerable to? All in the name of national security, which probably more accurately is national insecurity.
I would say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, question here. So people are experiencing stuff a lot everywhere
They
and
are.
interpreting some of these things differently. Do you think, as a human collective, is our consciousness being prepared for something, some cosmic truth or something? Do you have any thoughts about that?
The honest answer is probably I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time in that. Uh, if so, I have to guess. I don't think so. I don't see any evidence that it is. I know
Yeah.
many feel that way. I can't say they're wrong, right? I Again, that almost implies that to me that there's a master plan and one cause for the unknowns, but maybe not. No, I almost have to follow that. I don't know. When I first got involved in this in the early 90s, those kinds of things really would keep me awake at night, and I'd think about that, right?
Yeah.
The big questions, point of origin, mission here, right? The more I get out of the armchair and you get up close personal with the unknown, and we're lucky enough to, I mean, what I've been so lucky at, I think, compared to a lot of people working from nothing, nowhere, and not being part of a group, is the access I've had and the amount of times I've been able to talk face to face or on the phone with the people who were there, whether it was the witnesses or the generals or the intelligence people
Yeah.
or, I mean, I've been very lucky with that. And, the impression that I get is that many people feel that way. But in me, the importance of that for me is greatly diminished. I just find there's so much work to do, and I just want to get close and personal. I want to feel that hair stand up my neck again.
Yeah.
And it's like every time, you reprove it to yourself, like, because over time it fades. You're still there. You still persist. You still know what you know. You still believe. But boy, every time you get that lucky break, every time you make that right connection, every time you draw the right dotted line and it turns to a solid line and you've got something that everyone missed, it's like, yes, that just charges the batteries and you go on. Less and less is it those big mothership questions to me,
Yeah.
It's just bigger than me. I'll leave it to a greater mind than myself, If there's a message with me, it's persistence pays off. And I'm still amazed that when people tell me, well, I tried and I couldn't Google something up. And I go, and then what did you do? And they shrug. I'm like, oh, well, now's the time to get out of the armchair,
Yeah.
Do you have some names? Find these people, talk to them, push their buttons,
Right.
Demand an answer, right? I mean, I have to laugh, it's so funny. And when you show slides, and sometimes somebody asks me a question quick at the end of a presentation, and I'll say, yeah, well, I learned that from the KGB, now the SRB or whatever, they're currently, and they're like, well, what reference did you have that? Well, I talked to the agents. Well, how'd you do that? Well, I called Foreign Affairs and they set up a meet. And I go, look, I'll show you the slide of the letter that came back. Like, it took 50 weeks to get an answer, and they warned me what I was walking into. But, no guts, no glory, right? You got to do it, right? But, I mean, you got to go to the armchair. I mean, look, I use Google, but, I mean, you're not going to find... Look, when I first tried to Google Shag Harbor, it said a tiny fishing village on the shore of Nova Scotia, period.
And that was it, right?
Yeah, it's changed since, right? And it's not from anything I put there. It's like when people say, oh, I see you're all over the internet. Well, I don't keep a website. I don't do social media. I've never posted anything there.
Right.
But somehow it ends up there. I don't know.
Well, and
it's just
funny.
Too much to do.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say, it's funny because, this is an opportunity, and I'm trying to take this opportunity to get some different questions to a guy like you, your name is out there, and you are well known for some things, and all of a sudden people might I wonder what he thinks about this. And so I'm asking a few questions here because I think this is cool, because people will go, well, I don't know how I feel about that, but I know Chris, who I respect, does this and this, feels like this might be what's going on. So I think some of these questions are kind of cool. And like this one right here, do you think reality is fixed? It's an eternal thing, or is it something that's more fluid, influenced by perception and frequency? Right? This is a different question, but I'm curious what you think.
Well, I think the ancient Greeks thought about that quite a bit even. You think about, what was it, that play, the one where, they're in the cave and they can only see their shadows projected on the other wall. I mean, so obviously this is not a new question or perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Do I think it's fixed? No, I don't think it's fixed, but I think both sides of that are in motion. The universe is in motion and constantly changes, I think, and including the laws of physics over time, but on a scale of time that we probably don't have to worry about it. And, it also changes as our understanding changes our perception, the filters that are there, right? So I don't think it's fixed, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the sort of secondary proofs of that is how often nowadays in our lives, certainly me and somebody probably of your age too, Tony, is that when you look at how much a concept will start in fiction and we see it turn into reality over the next few years.
Very true.
I mean, you think about it, I look at this laptop that I'm talking to you on, and it's a $200 laptop I bought at Staples here. And it's doing things now that it wasn't built to do via software changes and development, right? Yeah. So,
It's interesting. Yeah.
uh,
Well, Chris, anything else in this space that we should talk about? I mean,
well,
I
can I
think it's
do
one
a
of those things that I
shameless
think
plug
it's gonna.
here for
Yeah,
our
let's. Yeah.
UFO conference, right?
Yeah.
Again, and that happens in October, and it's going to be on the anniversary of the Shag Harbor incident. And
Yeah.
I'm also glad to say it's not in the tiny fishing village of Shag Harbor, which just couldn't hold such an event, but the nearby town of Yarmouth, a place Betty Hill used to like to visit and go to, take the ferry over from Maine when she drive up from Portsmouth. I remember. I knew Betty fairly well when she passed. But yeah, we're having a conference there. I don't usually plug things from that. But I like to mention this one because for people that have become jaded or think, is it a good time to travel or is it worth it or, they're all the same. This is one that's truly different. Here's how. Is when you go to the things often, you'll see a roster a day of presentations from so-called experts. Well, we have that. That's there.
Yeah.
And like this year, they're going to have people like Kevin Randall's the keynote speaker, Mark D'Antonio, Preston Dennett, and Dolly Safran, and Martin Willis will be the MC, and we got lots of others. There's a dedicated website toward it at shagharborufo.com. But here's what's different is the next day we put people in buses and we drive them to the site of the Shag Harbor crash. And unlike a case like Roswell, there's no argument as to where it happened. And the Coast Guard comes and does a little demo and shoot flares off, right? We also
Cool.
drive the remains that are still there of Canada's most secret base, which was a U.S. base on Canadian soil, and the Coordination Center for Submarine Detection in the Atlantic. And right standing in that base by the gates, we can see the point where the Shelburne USO case played out, where there was a NATO mission with 10 U.S. warships and 8 Canadian that set over 2 USOs in the dying days of the Eisenhower administration back in October 1960. And this is a case that we now know actually resulted in a declaration within that limited area of declaring DEFCON 1, something the history books say didn't happen. We know that not just through testimony, but I've since recovered the ship's log of HMCS Cape Scott, which was the command ship of the mission because they were in Canadian waters. We take you right there. So at this conference, you can meet the expert. Yeah, you can also meet the eyewitnesses. Laurie Wickens, who's head of the society down there, was the first guy to call the RCMP the night of the Shag Harbor UFO crash. He'll be right there explaining and pointing it out from the site. So, for that one stop, and, if you're coming here from the U.S., here's the Canadian money isn't worth a lot. Your U.S. dollars go far. And we have a special rate where the hotel, and it's a really nice hotel in Yarmouth, a Grand Hotel, the rooms there go for 109 Canadian if you're an attendee. So that's like nothing. What's that? $70 American a night for a room with 2 queen beds and all this thing. I'm starting to sound like a commercial. But anyway, there's the thing. We take you, like I say, right to the actual sites where these events happen, and it's kind of different. You can meet the eyewitnesses, you can meet these experiencers there, and the so-called experts. And I'm there every year. I always tell them they don't have to do that, but I guess somebody always wants to hear about Shag Harbor and Shelburne. And I squeeze in a little about these other things I can do because I like to think I do more than that. But if you get tired of the big ones and you want to hear something truly different, come to the Tailpipe in North America and go to the Shag Harbor UFO Expo, as it's called. So shagharborUFOexpo.com will answer anything. It'll be one like no other you've been to, I'll tell you. In a fishing village one day and in a small town the next, and everything in between. So
that's cool. Lots of value there for people.
What was that?
Lots of value there for people.
Yeah,
I mean, good event, not expensive, everything.
It's got all that stuff. Yeah, and at the same time there'll be T-shirts. Oh yeah, we take you to the little museum, and wow. Yeah, I look forward to it
October.
every year going down. Like this is about the fifth year for it, and
Yeah.
we're hoping to build a proper museum in the years to come and that. But we've had some land donated, but there's a whole lot of work there. But I've always been so welcome there, and the community is accepted this case, and it's part of Canadian history now. And we've had people come from Europe and even Scotland, Japan for these. Like you don't get many. Some years, we've had this thing was born in fire. I'm going to tell you because the first few years we were dealing with COVID and border problems, right?
Yeah.
And then we got hit by a hurricane just before an event and had to clean up and managed to pull it off. But we've hung on and it's still there, and it's a unique thing. And anyway, hopefully we'll see some more U.S. people. Some years we get quite a few, and other days it's more a local crowd.
Yeah.
And of course, everybody's still welcome to come here. So sorry, the politics have stopped some of the tourism here, but yeah, that's
And
it.
it's October
Treat yourself.
3rd through 5th.
Yeah, it's October 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Like I say on the website there, shagharborufo.com. There's everything from the program to the speakers to how to book, to buy tickets, whatever.
Yeah.
And
That's perfect.
yeah, that
There you
is.
go, people.
Yeah.
You want to get away? Have a
That's
good
it.
weekend? This is a place.
Yeah, well, it's an
Yeah.
experience, Not many people can, and as long as the gates are there, that museum, it usually wraps up with me at the gates and everybody's there in a huddle around where I point out where the Shelburne USO case was, where live aliens were seen on the bottom and 2 USOs under 18 NATO ships, working together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Back when Canada still had a 60-ship navy. We certainly don't now, although
Right.
now we're looking at some French submarines and a few things, a few toys. We built some new ships there in Halifax, but they send them up north to the high Arctic because the government in Ottawa finally realized we got 3 oceans to patrol, not 2,
Mm-hmm.
as that one melts. Well, look, Tony, yeah, this has been a
Well,
slice.
Chris,
It's been a pleasure. I like the questions.
Yeah.
I was hoping for tougher ones. I always like tough questions. I don't get a
Yeah.
lot, right? And the funny
No,
when
I
the
think this is
skeptical
good.
people,
I had to get baby fed myself on this too because I needed to just learn more about it as well. So
well, we all
maybe
do.
in the future you'll get tougher questions, but these are good for me anyway. So
Yeah, because I laugh whenever I've done live lectures before, and you've had people there from SciScope or the late Phil class. It's funny,
Mhm.
they usually come up afterwards and they're very gracious and complimentary to me, really.
yeah,
And to be honest, I'm disappointed. I'm wait for a tough question. And of course, I
Yeah.
never worry about that because I'm one of the few. I'm not afraid to say I don't know. 'Cause
Yeah.
there are many things
Yeah.
I don't. Some people feel compelled they have to give an answer, but nah, we don't
That's
know
right.
it all. Nobody does. And that's the thing with science and ufology, too,
yes,
is that it's not like Buddhism. Like in Buddhism, the truth never changes, but in science and ufology, the truth changes all the time,
right.
right? Even physics.
It does. Yeah. Well, Chris, before we wrap up, I do have one question for you.
Yeah.
Without giving too many details here, I remember we talked before, and there was the possibility of some film. I don't know if it was Shag Harbor or Shelburne that you were going to be pursuing. All I'm going to ask you is, I know that's something you were looking at.
Yeah,
Any
that's a
progress
long-term
there?
pursuit, but yeah. So what are you asking me? Is there any progress or what?
Any progress? Yeah.
There is, in the sense that I've written a presentation, and the hard thing right now is just to figure exactly who I get involved, and that includes people maybe in the U.S. government, maybe the Five Eyes partners. That's the hardest thing right now, and to reach out. And I think the main push, and I may have something to say the next time I speak with you there. Looks like we're about to get the hook here, Tony, so I'll leave it.
Yeah.
That's our cliffhanger still.
There
for
you
the
go.
Next time. But catch me a little earlier with that one, and I can give you more idea. There we go. Got to have something for a cliffhanger.
That's right.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed this, and anytime.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank
Chris,
you.
thank you again. And for everybody out there, don't forget, Shag Harbor Expo, UFO Expo, October 3rd through 5th. And great books here by Chris Stiles. Go to his site. And there we go. Reality transformation, your first dip into that topic. Very interesting. And for the rest of you, thank you for joining us as well and watching this episode.
And as always, remember, there is a lot of strange and unexpected in our reality. So always keep your eyes, ears, and minds open. And until next time, stay safe.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.